Today is Wednesday, July 3rd, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. My family's gearing up to head out to teen camp. They'll be leaving over the July 4th weekend, actually leaving tomorrow morning, so I'll be kind of bacheloring it again for while they're gone. Although my mother-in-law will be here. That'll be nice. She and I will survive. I think we can do it. But actually looking forward to the weekend. That said, looking forward to some time off, spend some time with the rest of the family tomorrow. So, doing really well.
Well, the office is closed for us Thursday and Friday, so
Right.
we are recording this podcast a little bit earlier than we normally would, but we didn't want to disappoint our listeners and to have a podcast, and we have a couple idea or a idea with several points. What are we talking about today, Mr. Smith?
We do. The fact that tomorrow is July 4th, which for those of our listeners, our youth, our teens, and our young adults listening, it may not mean as much to you in all these other countries, but it means a lot here in America. July 4th being Independence Day, we have our country on our mind, and we thought, especially prompted by the fact that one of our listeners suggested this topic, we thought we'd discuss why it is that we in the Living Church of God are not political and do not get involved in politics. Why don't we take a look at that and review the very good reasons why we don't do that. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And tomorrow is indeed July 4th. And I think I can speak for Mr. Robinson when I say this, but I'll check here in a second. We love our country. You love your country, Mr. Robinson?
Yeah, I do. And at the very least, America's been very good to us. We've grown up in a relatively safe environment. We were educated. It's easy to forget that most people in human history could not read or write, and we just take these things for granted. I think I mentioned this recently. We grew up in a time where we had indoor plumbing and electricity, and it was strange to me when I talked to older people and found out that they had not had those things
Right.
growing up. So we've been very, very blessed to live in the United States these last 50 plus years.
Yeah, we really have. I've tried to bring that point up sometimes when people talk about, it's so difficult in this country now where Christians are oppressed or, we're being persecuted. And I say, look, the level of persecution you're talking about in historical terms doesn't even count as persecution. Yeah. You're talking about swimming a little bit upstream. Go look at the Roman times. Go look at this body of people and this body of people. The fact even that this podcast still exists, would Stalin have allowed anything, so we have to have things in perspective. And the fact is that God has blessed America with a lot of blessings it does not deserve and has never truly deserved throughout its entire history. It's important to recognize that. It's because of Abraham's obedience that we enjoy the blessings that we do, and we're not to knock it. And I've learned that when it comes to loving your country and the culture of your country, as long as they're not sinful elements of the culture, it's even to a certain extent a kind of a biblical thing. God wants us attached to our homelands. It's not a wrong thing.
Well, you gave a sermon here. It seems like it was during early COVID, so that dated like 2020.
Oh, right.
Where you talked about that. Is it okay to have a national holiday? And you brought out that it was. The Jews and what Christ mentioned, even the Feast of Dedication. I think
he was there. Yeah, he actually was there. He didn't ignore it. That's exactly right. It's not, I think, what was the title of that one? I think it was God's Perspective on America. I think that was that. Yeah, you're right. That was right at the beginning of COVID. So it's not wrong to love your country, and it's not wrong to love your culture and to feel that attachment, especially if countries really are what God intended them to be, which is families grown large. It's kind of like loving your family. But loving your family also requires honesty, right? If Uncle Ceiling Wall is a drunk, loving your family doesn't mean ignoring that fact, right? It means understanding that fact. And right now, I know you would agree, Mr. Robinson, our country, at least the United States of America, and we'll get to the point, by the way, if you're not an American citizen, how this really should still apply to you. But it's going through a difficult time, right? In fact, the letter we received from the young lady, thank you out there, young lady, who sent us a letter wanting to talk about this topic, I don't think it was a coincidence that was not long, or was around the same day as the debate that took place between Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden recently. And that debate, honestly, was painful personally. And I haven't even seen the whole thing. I think the cringe factor in my spine would actually debilitate me, perhaps if I did. I've seen enough to know that it was actually a reminder that God is allowing the full consequences of democracy to rest on our heads. It's not exactly the same as, we get the leaders we always deserve, because actually it's part of sometimes, but when it comes to democracy, the quality of your leaders is very much tied to the quality of your people in terms of spirituality and morality. And we're seeing that. If you look at our military, it's still one of the best in the world, but it's not because the vector is pointing upward. I mean, the vector is pointing downward. Our economy is in trouble. You'll hear this really positive sign at a certain point in the news, then you'll hear the really negative sign, and all of that really indicates kind of a chaos, just this kind of potential storm where everything is in confusion, and some of the predictors just don't predict well anymore. And then finally, our morality. You look at the morality in the country, and it's a cesspool.
Yeah.
On one hand, it's nice to see some kind of turnaround where some people are looking at how bad things are and saying, "Whoa, this is crazy." At the same time, it's a terrible sign to think it had to get this far. That's my idea that, some things are kind of bouncing back. But why do they bounce back? Because when something hits the very bottom, there's a bit of recoil. The fact that we even got as far as we have, where now of the two presumptive candidates for president, and who knows what's going to happen between now and the actual election, but the two presumptive candidates for presidency in the United States, one of them, his position on abortion is kind of shifted. Now he's just talking about keeping it in the states, but he's outright said he would not sign a national ban. Even if Congress approved a national ban, he would not sign that. And this is the conservative candidate, quote unquote. And why would he say that? He's blatant about why he says it. Back when he early said that, about a 15-week allowing abortion up to 15 weeks, he said would probably be wise. And he was straightforward. The one thing I do appreciate about him is at least transparent. He says, because that's about what you need to be elected. Mm-hmm. He said, you just, right, if you go earlier in 15 weeks, I don't think you could be elected with that. And his goal is to be elected. Yeah. It's not on a principle of, human life matters. We got to save all the life in the womb. He wants to make sure he's elected.
Yeah. It's not really a moral, ethical position so much as it is a political position.
And that really brings us to the crux that we're talking about today, which is we're not political.
Right. And what's interesting? I genuinely wish I could remember who said this to me, and they were so right. And maybe it was you, Mr. Smith, and then you take credit for being so right. But somebody pointed out how our standards have shifted on conservatism and liberalism in our politicians. And if you took Donald Trump and you took him back in time and ran him against Ronald Reagan, every single conservative Republican would look at Trump as a lefty New Yorker who believed in abortion, and the opinions would be very, very different on him.
Oh, that was not me, and that's a great observation. I've actually thought not of Mr. Reagan, but I've thought of Mr. Clinton. Way back, we had cause to look at it recently. There was an old article. I can't remember if it was on the cover of the magazine, and we literally looked at it for this reason, or if it was inside the magazine, but it was back when you had some of the controversies concerning President Bill Clinton, Democratic president, I think 1992 to 2000, about that.
Yep.
And he had certain immoral practices that were associated with him while he was in office, was impeached actually over those things. And we had an article, I think, in the Tomorrow's World magazine about character matters, right? Character matters. If it wasn't Tomorrow's World, it was The World Ahead before that in the Global Church of God. I can't remember, because it might have been a bit after that. Or does character matter was the question. I think it was a Mr. Gwynn article. I could be wrong on all these things. However, back then, I think of what Rush Limbaugh was saying back when President Clinton was president.
Yep.
And I think you take the stance they took that morality matters and character matters and saying this matters and this behavior matters. Back then, when those very things were used to bash President Clinton, so much of that, it's like, well, that's out the window, right? Because now the guy they really need as a champion doesn't fit those things so much. And by the way, I'm not trying to bash our current candidates in that sense. I'm just trying to look rather at our focus as a people and how it's amazing how the goalposts keep moving around about what makes a difference in terms of being a good leader.
Yes.
Because politics has bred into us, and maybe we'll get to that in some of the points, I say bred into us. We're trying to avoid politics, but politics it generates this attitude of winning is what matters. Because if you don't win, you can't do anything. And so that's part of, and we'll kind of get into it, this kind of corruption that comes with politics. Our point today is to emphasize that we are not political in the living church of God, and we do not get involved in politics. We do not go to the voting booth. We do not cast a vote for this candidate or that candidate. We don't put signs in our yard. We do not involve ourselves in politics. And especially for you teens and young adults out there who are our audience for the podcast, the Living Youth Podcast, it's so important for you to understand that, partially because you don't have the history. We go back to, I only started attending the church in 1989, and yet I remember so much political discussion in terms of how we don't do this, don't do that. I remember the Plain Truth magazines I got before I was actually attending. We have a certain history of that you don't have, and yet you are, our dear young audience, the target audience for all of the influencers and manipulators that are trying to capture votes for their candidates and for their causes. They recognize the rest of us are dying away one day, but they want to capture your mind and use the power of your votes, if you will, for their causes. And so you are the target. You have a big target on your back for the individuals that want to capture your thinking, and it's vital that here in the body of Christ that you remember and you understand why we do not involve ourselves in those things. In fact, this is probably as good a place as any to let Disclaimer Guy come out and do his thing to remind you of that. And hopefully this is a familiar sounding disclaimer because we've given it before. Disclaimer Guy, go.
The Living Church of God does not involve itself in politics. Any resemblance between the comments that follow and getting involved in politics is purely coincidental, or is a figment of your imagination. Control yourself.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. And, before I stop ranting, Mr. Robinson, I want to say one thing because I've even gotten letters from, I say one or two letters from readers from our magazine about this. We might use the word democracy here and there and talk about America being a democracy. And I know some of you out there might just be, it's just like fingernails on a chalkboard saying, we are not a democracy. We're a republic. Get your act together and get it right. Look, I understand that we are a republic, and I've read documents from the original founders, not in their original hand, in books, where they highlight the dangers of a democracy and how they need to make a republic because the majority rule can be dangerous and having people decide on every little thing. I get that. We're not ignoring all that. At the same time, many of the people who press that we're a republic, not a democracy, are ignoring the facts, and they're trying to make a point that frankly does not apply. Because one, we're not just a republic. We are a democratic republic. Votes matter. This is a democratic nation. For those who want to say, no, it's not a democracy, just kind of put aside the technical details and focus on the fact that, yes, we are a democratic republic. Yes, we have people who represent us in our form of government here in the U.S., as our representatives in a republic, but how did they get there? Because they were elected by the people. How do they keep their jobs? By keeping enough people happy that they continue to be elected. It is essentially still it's democracy by proxy, if you want to, but those who split hairs about that ignore the point. In fact, part of, not always the same, but many of the same people, when the people they elect ignored the will of the people, get all upset. What are they doing there? They're supposed to represent the will of the people. Well, you know what? If it's not a democracy, then no, they're not. Then they have no obligation to represent the will of the people. The fact is, don't get technical about this. Just think of the spirit of democracy, if you will. Just like Abraham Lincoln said, and I'll probably get it out of order, but a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Think of it that way. And please don't write us any nasty letters saying that we're a republic and not a democracy. I already know that.
Do we get those?
Well, as the editor of the magazine, Mr. Robinson, yes, we do actually on occasion.
Okay.
So yeah, we've not from our wonderful teens and young adults for that. Or really, I don't think I've ever gotten something from a church member. But yeah, I had the guy actually liked to write a lot of angry letters. He doesn't like a lot of things that we write. So that was just one.
Well, there's so many thoughts swim through my head on this topic. And so, for example, let's say I don't want to. I deliberately want to be fuzzy on the reasoning. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. But let's say we felt like it was okay to vote and kind of get involved in politics. Well, my first thought would be, well, where do you start? And and you and I have talked about President Trump before, and I know there's always a risk with being specific about a candidate. But
Yeah, I was being vague earlier, but it was a pointless vagueness we were not talking about.
Well, look, I can understand why he can appeals to those more conservative politically in the United States. And the church has always been more closely aligned with conservative ideas politically than certainly.
Yeah, there's moral things we value that tend to be better reflected on a more conservative platform, right?
But just imagine what you have to overlook if you do want to support President Trump to become the president. And I would argue, with very, very few exceptions, that would apply to almost anybody that you would want to get involved with and support. There's always kinds of problems and moral issues. Not all of them. I don't know. But this kind of highlights the quandary.
Yeah, and we might get our notes are thick in this time. I'm not sure we're going to get through all of our notes for the podcast, but that's one of the quandaries is that political support almost always involves a profound compromise, and you start, like we mentioned the abortion situation earlier, and I'm not trying to pick apart Mr. Trump. Again, one of the things that I appreciate about him is his transparency. In fact, sometimes he's one of those that even when he lies so transparently. It's refreshing, versus subtlety, because he's a wheeler and a dealer, and in wheeling and dealing, falsehoods is part of what you trade in. And so when he was just straight up when they asked him about abortion after the Dobbs ruling and such. And he's like, 15 weeks, I think. I don't think anyone, if you try to ban abortion earlier than 15 weeks, I don't think you can be elected.
Yeah,
so that's where I would stick my flag. And it's like, well, he's transparent about it, but am I going to be transparent about someone that takes an immoral stand and at least they're transparent about their immorality? Mm-hmm. How far do you fall in terms of your standards if you come to a place where you embrace things like that and you're okay with that?
Then the other thought I had, I think that there's also, from a biblical perspective, there's fundamentally a problem with the idea of democracy. In fact, I don't know if you can apply this exactly. To me, this makes a lot of sense, but the description of the Laodicean era is the people decide. That's one of the essence of it. And so I do think that there's often parallels in the world to parallels in the church. They're just a little different. But here we are. What have we been doing the last 100 years? We've been touting Western-style democracy. And if we could just spread it to the rest of the world,
right.
we'd all. But that's not working out. And we're living long enough. You and I have been in like a privileged position to watch democracy slowly fail.
Yeah.
And we're seeing the many things that are problematic about the democracy, including how we select our leaders, which is a major problem. But then the other thing is, fact check me on this, Mr. Smith. No, logic check me on this, okay?
Okay.
So it was a government for the people, by the people, of the people.
I don't know if that's the order, but yeah, those three parts.
But this is where ignoring God instituting the idea of the Jubilee comes into play. Every 50 years, everything kind of resets so that people who've accumulated lots of money, because so if you understand it biblically, the value was always tied to the land. And so land ownership was key. And so you could sell your land, but under God's system, it was more of a lease. And after 50 years, it would revert back to its original family and its holdings. So it limited people collecting the bulk of the wealth over long periods of time.
In some kind of permanent capacity where a family would lose out on that capacity forever.
So what happens, which is what I believe has happened in the United States, I think you could make a pretty compelling case. I don't know. I can't remember if I talked on the podcast or not about Patrick Bet David. It was a 10-minute clip, and he went through and detailed how the three largest, Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street, I think, owned like over 80%, were the largest shareholders in over 80% of the companies on the Standard & Poor's 500. In other words, it is a huge amount of influence over the largest companies in the world. And so after a while, what makes the decisions almost anywhere, it's not the people voting, it's the money. It's who has control of it. And pretty soon your elected officials are more beholden to the larger companies with all the money than they are to their own citizens. So that's part of why at times when the people get frustrated because they don't feel like their politician is voting for them, it's because there's outside influences that have gained so much power and money that those begin to drive the decision.
It's a carnal system, and it's always going to be susceptible to carnal influence. That's just the way it is. And, Mr. Robinson, and all this talk that we're doing, part of me is a little concerned that it sounds like we're being very anti-Mr. Trump, and I don't mean to be. For instance, part of why I'm focused on that is because I'm detecting my own sympathies, right? I'm kind of self-examination, looking a little bit. And my own sympathies tend to, in terms of preferences, go in that direction because also the abominable policies that the current administration have put in place. Under Mr. Biden, we have seen transgender rights just actively embraced to the point that you have men dressing as women in various roles in government, to the point that the government has decided we're going to try to encourage other countries to embrace these kinds of things. So let me highlight it. We're not trying to, neither I, well, Mr. Robinson can speak for himself in a second. We're not trying to pick on any one candidate in this case, and we're certainly not trying to pick on Mr. Trump because the other candidate and his party and his administration have been morally abominable. But that's part of the point, is that we're talking about participating in government regardless of who's involved.
There are some things different about the way the government is currently being administered that is truly nothing like has happened in the United States before, and that is the weight. And at this point, it is a very weighty federal government, is it not, Mr. Smith? A weighty executive branch and the federal bureaucracy that is the United States government has put its weight behind these policies of the gender affirming care. In fact, if you're a therapist and you're not practicing gender affirming care, you're gonna get in trouble, and maybe you're gonna lose your license. It's like forcing behavior in a way that the government historically has stayed out of. It's things like contentious things like are we gonna drill oil in the pristine Alaskan wilderness, and debates back and forth about how to spend the money and all these kinds of things. But the current administration, no bones about it, has really pushed truly a radical progressive agenda that shocks. You and I have both listened to various people that we would consider very liberal, very on the left side, and they're like, "Hey, I haven't changed. The progressives have changed.
Yeah,
the
even
party
they're
has
shocked.
changed. Yeah, they're
Right.
shocked by how it's shifted way beyond their left-leaning tendencies into something that's unrecognizable in U.S. politics, based on history.
Right. So we're not trying to ignore facts, and we are not blind to the things we see. But if anything, what we're hoping is that helps to emphasize our point, is that our non-participation isn't even about the people that are involved. It's because of larger principles and principles illustrated by these biblical verses we'll be looking at.
It truly, the way of framing this that keeps popping up in my head, I think, is one of the best ones. It's not choosing the best candidates. We are choosing between the lesser of two evils.
And as we jump into scriptural topics, we want to think biblically, Mr. Robinson, like you didn't know that. We want to highlight this really isn't about the candidates. Mr. Robinson hit it so well. God doesn't just say, stay out of politics unless it's really good guys. He doesn't say that. And we're not actually trying to pick on them. Like on one, let me put on my carnal thinking hat. Who can blame Mr. Trump for trying to pick a position that helps you get elected? Because you know what the other guy's doing? The same thing. Mr. Biden wants abortion, all the way up to pregnancy. To birth. Really, that's kind of a stand. But at the same time, and there's this great video by C.G.P. Gray that's rooted in a book, I think, Hymn Book for Dictators, that one of my sons even assigned in college. We were familiar with the book before that. I might be getting the title wrong.
I can't remember. I think it was a split sermon where I tried to quote you on that, and
really?
I had it all wrong.
I tried to build a whole sermon during a feast on that. One of the worst sermons I've ever given in my life. I need to retool that. But they highlight that whether you're a dictator or whether you're a Democratic politician, whether you're, say, a monarch, that there are certain sets of rules you always have to follow. These political scientists who did this research, you always have to keep in mind if you're going to rule in this world. And among them is that you have to keep your key supporters satisfied. There's no physical human ruler. Now, of course, with Christ, he has one key supporter, and that is his Father, and he will always keep him satisfied. All the other ones have other humans they have to keep satisfied. And Mr. Trump and Mr. Biden both, they have to keep their supporters somewhat satisfied. And he boils it down on the CGP Grey video to kind of a rule number 0, like a kind of a rule that rules them all, if you will, which is without power, you can't do anything. Like if you really think about it from a carnal perspective, in Mr. Trump's position, let's say he secretly wanted to ban all elective abortions, versus health exceptions, et cetera. He'd say he just really wanted all elective abortions to be banned, but he knows he can't be elected on such a position. Well, then why would it be in his interest to admit that, on the trail, right? In fact, I'm not trying to be accusatory, but many people have suspected that President Obama, before Mr. Trump, did a similar thing concerning so-called homosexual marriage, where he said, well, I believe marriage is a man and a woman. And then once he's in office, it takes a while. In fact, I remember reading an article at the time where some homosexuals were being interviewed, and they were frustrated because they voted for Mr. Obama on the assumption he was lying, because they just really felt that he did believe as they did. They wanted to be quote unquote married. And then eventually he said his position has evolved and he did embrace, the homosexual quote unquote marriage. Well, yeah, if you don't win, you can't do anything. So it's a system that rewards that kind of thinking. Now that brings it down to, what if you want to give Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, depending on your preference, a kind of a pass? It's like, well, I think that deep down their virtues are strong. They just know they got to do certain things to be elected. Well, then great. That brings it into the realm of what we're talking about here today, because we're talking about politics in general. In fact, this would apply to any country. It doesn't just apply to the United States of America, though that's the basis of mine and Mr. Robinson's experience. We're going to talk about biblical reasons, biblical passages even, that should come to mind whenever there's a temptation to get involved in politics.
Yeah.
And we'll start with the first. Okay, we jump into it, Mr. Robinson?
Yeah, no, let's, because we both, I started to put together some of my own notes, and the first thing I brought out was Daniel 4.
Ah, great.
Because we'll read it here in a minute, but this was the other idea I was having before we led to this point, which was, let's say that we all agreed the church should put all its manpower and resources into getting somebody elected.
Yeah.
Well,
very radical change.
Yeah. Well, what if we backed the guy that God didn't want?
Right.
And then Daniel makes that point.
Oh, he sure does. You mentioned Daniel 4,
Well,
7.
the one I brought was 17. Was the one I was
okay, really? Okay, what is that? What does it say there?
Okay, Daniel 4:17. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the holy ones, in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. So, for example, there was a lot of people that, not everybody, but a lot of people felt like that President Biden did not actually get enough votes, and the election through election malfeasance was stolen from Donald Trump. And so, boy, that's not fair, and you can fight against it. But who decided who our leader was going to be?
Right.
He decided it was going to be Biden. And so even if there was election malfeasance, so what? What are you going to do about it? And you're going to try to you don't realize it, but you're fighting to overturn what God has decreed.
What we do know, and I can imagine, caterwauling about a statement like this, but if you believe what we understand, God clearly wanted Mr. Biden to be president during this time. I actually missed in my notes. I had written Daniel 4:7. I think it was 17. I like the King James Version translation of that because it talks about him. It uses instead of lowest, it says basest. I just love that kind of classic word.
That is good.
That God even appoints the basest of men. And then Daniel brings it up again. This is the first passage we're talking about, the one Mr. Robinson brought up. Later on in Daniel chapter 5, where now Belshazzar is reigning, and this is the famous handwriting on the wall scene. And Daniel's been brought in, and he's trying to highlight to Belshazzar, don't forget what happened to your recent ancestor Nebuchadnezzar, how God actually sent him into the wilderness out of his mind to live like an animal when he was full of pride, to show him you weren't in this position because you were great. He said, you're in this position because I decided, God said. And Daniel summarizes the same lesson for Belshazzar, that God did this to Nebuchadnezzar. God humbled Nebuchadnezzar, quote, till he knew that the Most High God rules in the kingdom of man and appoints over it whomever he chooses.
Mm-hmm.
And Mr. Robinson brought it out where it talks specifically about fighting against God is in Acts chapter 5 and verse 39. And if I recall, that's when Gamaliel is giving his advice to the Jews who want to push back on all this Christian preaching. They believe that, they had Jesus Christ executed, through the Romans. And here you have these upstarts, and they're preaching in his name, and everyone's listening. And he says, whoa, hang on. I understand you want to execute these guys. Look, don't we all? He didn't say that. But he said, look, the last time it was a nobody being preached by a bunch of guys, nothing really came of it. If this is of men, hey, it'll pass. But if it's of God, you could find yourself fighting against God, and who wants to be in that position? And so he advised them to hold hands off. And of course, it would have been fighting against God, because guess what? God's on the Christian side. Well, Mr. Robinson, you're exactly right. Right now,
I really like it when you say that, by the way.
And it happens so often. So let's just say for some reason we discovered, we were wrong. We need to vote. Let's all go vote. Okay. Well, who am I going to vote for?
Right.
And how do I know with 100% certainty that I'm not voting against the guy?
Exactly.
The guy's going to put in office. Now, you might say, well, it won't make a difference. God will still get that guy into office. Well, then all the more, what's the point of my casting my vote? The fact is, we believe in the living church of God that God indeed does appoint whom he wants to be in that position. God knows exactly what he's doing. And before we move on to the next point, I want to highlight the example of Mr. Roderick C. Meredith, whose autobiography went to the printer, yesterday, right?
Yep.
Hey, look at that. Hey, all
Yep.
right. So anyway, Mr. Roderick Meredith, back during the first Trump election in 2016, Dr. Meredith was alive. And I remember we even watched something. I can't remember what it was. Maybe we watched the inauguration. I can't recall. But before the election, man, and Dr. Meredith, he was an opinionated person. He had strong opinions. And yet he didn't pick a side and all that. He was upfront about Mr. Trump's faults, definitely upfront about Mrs. Clinton's faults. He talked about how, one of the concerns I had, and definitely I'm not saying I didn't have a favorite in that election. I was hoping Mr. Trump would be elected, but actually for a very specific reason. I was hoping for preservation of religious freedom in terms of the magazine, in terms of getting the gospel out, because frankly, Mr. Robinson, that's what I care about most, is that we can do our job and get the gospel out. And that's the main thing Dr. Meredith kind of focused on. And he didn't have a dog in the hunt. He was detached to the point that, we'll see what God wants. God might want this, God might want that, and we'll see what it is. And you could tell there was no interest in him in terms of trying to get so-and-so into office. He exemplified this position of the church because he believed in what Daniel says, the book of Daniel, chapter 4 and chapter 5. The Most High God is the one who rules in the kingdom of men, and he will appoint whomever he chooses, sometimes even the basest of men.
That kind of leads into another example that I really like, and that is, as Christians, as members of the Church of God, so, what position are we coming from? Like, what's our our viewpoint or our vantage point? And we're looking at things through the biblical lens, right? Well, I would highlight Philippians 3:18 through 20 for anybody that wants to go read about that. And in fact, I'll read it to you. But are we citizens of America? Yes, and physically we are. In fact, I have to get my passport renewed because of where we're going for the feast this year. But taking the long view of things and remembering that we are living a temporary physical existence, and the reality is the spirit realm and God and his heavenly abode and the city of Zion and in the heavenly abode. And when we are baptized, we're given God's Holy Spirit and we're given that down payment, we are not just citizens of the United States anymore. I prefer to think a citizen of Texas. Okay, but we'll take the United States. But what is Paul inspired to record, where our viewpoint should be and the way God views it. For many walk, of whom I have told you often, and now tell you even weeping, that they are the enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is in their belly, and whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. I could say we could, based on what we've talked about today, we could think of a lot of earthly things that we could get our minds on and get wrapped up in.
Wow.
But what does God say to us? For our citizenship is in heaven, from which we also eagerly wait for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ. And why do we wait for him? Because as Mr. Wakefield said in, I think, an article, you might have to double check me on where this is from if this sounds, but we use this in one of the other podcasts. Why do I have no hope that regardless of who becomes the president of the United States, we'll get any solutions to the vast problems that have developed in the United States? What has Mr. Wakefield said? The causes of the world's problems are spiritual, the effects are social and political, and the solutions are biblical. And we will not have true solutions and resolution and peace on earth until Christ returns, and he's going to do it his way. We're not, as again, Mr. Wakefield, he emphasized this again recently. God is not coming to renovate Satan's system. We're not coming to, what's the word where you fix something, renovate, restore, reform.
Reform.
That's what it is. Jesus Christ is not coming to reform Satan's system. He is literally going to replace it. I don't think this is controversial, but in the future we will not be voting for our leaders. We are not going to have three branches of government that are fundamentally aligned against each other to keep their power in check.
Not in the kingdom of God.
Not in the kingdom of God.
Mr. Robinson, that was a point later in my list, and I'm so glad you jumped there because I didn't even read the verses before Philippians 3:20. Philippians 3:20 is the one that I had in mind, but the verses you read leading up to Philippians 3:20 about our citizenship, like the last part of verse 19, where it highlights whose glory is in their shame, who set their mind on earthly things. When I see the temptation of politics pulling people away, it's easy to think their mind is not on earthly things, but at the same time it is. You can tell it's this kind of worrying about the contention of this world and how we're going to fix this world through this world's tools. And that's right, our citizenship, if you will, our primary citizenship. Yes, I'll be paying taxes to the United States government come April 15th or whatever next year, because I'm definitely a citizen of the United States. At the same time, I have a higher citizenship. In a sense, America is no longer my first home. I may have been born in America, but you know what? I was begotten anew for the kingdom of God. That kingdom that's coming is by far my primary homeland now. And unlike ancient Israel, where God would give a family a lot of land, as we talked about earlier, to be theirs throughout their generations, my lot of land isn't in this world anymore. I'm looking forward to one that's coming, right? And so with that in mind, that is an overriding citizenship. It's a greater allegiance, and it ties in with this point we'll make as our larger second point. Everything you've just said ties into 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 20. Where the Apostle Paul says, now then, we are ambassadors for Christ. Now, you could just stop right there and say, okay, we're ambassadors. So we're not of this country. We're representing a different country to come to this country. But boy, read that whole verse, because then what is your job as an ambassador? Let me start over in verse 20. Now then, we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were pleading through us, what? Pleading this, we implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. We are not trying to carry the message of, say, a Republican Party or a Democratic Party or a political party of any sort. We're not trying to communicate another platform. I appreciate that, say, banning abortion at 15 weeks will save more babies than having no ban at all. I can talk about the worldly wisdom of these different debates, but I have been sent as an ambassador, as you have been, Mr. Robinson, as all of our listeners have been. If we're ambassadors for Christ, then what is the singular message that we are to be delivering? It is that we implore people on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. The message, it is better to ban abortion at 15 weeks than it is to allow it with no ban, is not the same message. We're not here to try to, let alone trying to simply enact it on the side through votes when it can just be reversed if another party's in place. We have a job. We are to represent a coming kingdom, not represent the kingdom of this world. We're to represent that future kingdom to this kingdom, to say there is a better way, be reconciled to God, or frankly, face the natural consequences.
Well, my natural inclination is to want to start talking about this reconciliation process for our audience, but that would be a whole other podcast. But I was thinking, what for younger listeners who you hear that and you maybe you have an idea of what that means. What's your most concise explanation for? I love every time I read that. It's almost like it's the first time in a way, and I hear it and I think, man, there's something actually be poetic about it. This idea that God is pleading through us.
Isn't that amazing?
It makes me think about, I've heard lots of people, because starting about maybe 8 years ago when I started listening to a lot of podcasts, and I would deliberately go listen to the intellectuals because I want to hear what their quote unquote logic is and how they're influencing other people. And a common thing thrown out at God, an accusation is, well, why does God allow these things to happen? And if there was a real God, if he actually exists, I don't like him because he's not taking care of X, Y, and Z. Or if there is a God, well, why does he allow these things to happen?
Right.
And they willfully ignore it. It makes me think of the language there in Romans 1. This they willfully ignore. God's had his message out there the whole time.
Right.
Through different people and in different ways, but here at the end of the age, especially with Mr. Armstrong really ramping it up and using the modern radio and then into TV and then of course onto the internet. Now I've rambled myself off into a whole other thing, but what does it mean to be, what does it mean to be reconciled to God? And how is it that we are not reconciled to him right now, like normal people in the world?
As a people.
Yeah.
Right. Well, to reconcile yourself means to come alongside, right? Is that you're going your own way, like we, like sheep, have gone astray, right? Is to bring yourself in line with Christ. Democracy isn't really doing that. That's not what you're actually, it's, boy, like this book I commented on in the sermon that came out not too long ago, I guess, True Liberty and Freedom, I think it was. But in that, he kind of highlights that really the point of democracy, or what it's become, is realizing, hey, you got a better way. I'm going to try to go to the polls, and I'm going to try to force everybody to live this way, and that reconciles nobody. That is not actually bringing anybody really along. It's actually for us to be pleading. It's really interesting. I know I'm thinking of it more not because it came from the Bible, because of the old Robert Heinlein sci-fi book, which I've never read and I don't want to read based on various things I understand, but the title being A Stranger in a Strange Land. And this idea that we're pilgrims and strangers in a strange land, people hopefully interacting with us over time start to realize we're kind of not like them. We're not just ready to band with them together to go vote their guy into office or to stand for the party they believe in or the guy they believe in. But somehow we seem like we don't belong in a certain kind of way, like a stranger in a strange land, like pilgrims. And why should that be? Because somehow in our nature, in our demeanor over time, people should perceive, even if it's not from our words, that we in our actions in our life are making the case for something else. That in our actions, in our life, in our choices, in our example, we are making the case for being reconciled to God.
That reminded me of, just real quick, 1 Peter 4:4. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They can tell that you're different, and they think it's odd and don't understand why you've chosen this other path.
That's right. And yet, if all of your social media posts, if all of your talk, if everything else is all just as political as everybody else's, rooting for all the same guy, how in the world do you actually stand out in some kind of way as an ambassador?
Yeah.
Let's look at another point.
Yeah, you have a lot of great scriptures here. You want to speed run these?
Yeah, let's try and do that. Let's see. So here's another good hit. And by the way, I'm not saying any one of these by themselves is a single bullet verse, even though I got to admit Daniel really kind of is pretty silver bullety, but still, the church's position is long rooted in principles that are reflected in many places in the Bible, and this is just one of them. In John chapter 18, we have Jesus Christ talking to Pilate, and he's under arrest. He's about to be executed, and Pilate talking about, "Oh, are you a king? You got a kingdom?" And Jesus Christ says very plainly in verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Now, yes, the immediate context of this passage is Jesus Christ's crucifixion. That yes, if indeed he was a king of a worldly throne, if you will, that his followers would come and fight and keep him from, they'd keep him on his throne and not let him be persecuted by the Jews and executed by the Romans. But still, the principle Jesus Christ is citing here is far larger than that. He says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, then my servants would strive to respect my reign in this world and try to have force others to treat me as the king I am. Instead, for God's purposes, he had to be treated as not the king, right? The world had to be allowed to ignore and despise him and go their way.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ's kingdom is not of this world or this age, if you will. So therefore, what role should we be taking in this world to try to make it otherwise? What role should we be taking in trying to effectively enthrone Christ, quote unquote, and enthrone his judgments and put into force his decisions and his righteousness in this world before God himself has even decided to pull that trigger? I there's a sermon I'm thinking about giving this feast. I probably won't. It's kind of a last great day sermon, but not about the meaning of the day, when sometimes Mr. Weston covers that, about how our lives represent like an early beachhead of the kingdom. And there's also a limit to that. When they were taking Omaha Beach and such in World War II, they weren't also trying to conquer Berlin and conquer this. No, they had to focus on that beach. That was the beachhead. Until Christ actually is sent with his kingdom, all of our individual lives are the beachhead. We are to be devoted to conquering that ground that's right here, the only ground I actually truly control. To kind of go ahead of that is go, hey, I'm going to, forget Omaha, I'm going to go take Berlin. No, it's not time for taking Berlin. It's time for taking you. Jesus Christ has declared you to be a part of that kingdom. We are having the devil rooted out. Christ is taking ground in us. But who are we to say, God, I'm not going to wait for you. I'm going to try to enact your good and just laws in this world now, in the midst of the devil's world, if you will. When Jesus Christ says, you know what? My kingdom's not of this world.
I don't think it's a stretch to you to apply. His answer is a little bit like, hey, my citizenship is in heaven.
It is
kind of a
very
similar
much.
application.
Yeah, you're right. I didn't think about that. If we're doing a speed run.
Yeah, speed run.
All right, speed run. Next, James chapter 3 and verse 16. And this might not seem direct, but give us a moment. In James 3 and verse 16, we're warned by James, for where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are there. And at the heart of this is a reminder, politics, by its nature, by its unavoidable nature, politics corrupts. Show me a political system in which envy and self-seeking have not existed, that hasn't brought in eventually confusion and every evil thing. Because we're not just talking about a type of democracy, or we're not talking about the people involved in the democracy. We're talking about God not wanting us to participate in the devil's means for fixing, quote unquote, this world. Politics is inherently competitive. And I wrote in my notes, it's not the fun kind of competitive, like playing ultimate frisbee with your friends or something like that. It's about wielding power to shape the world. And in a similar statement, the Apostle Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 3, chastising them for their attitudes. And he says, "For you are still carnal. For where there are envy, strife, and divisions among you, are you not carnal and behaving like mere men?" Christ is expecting us to rise above mere men and not to strive in the same kinds of ways.
I think I think that can be seen a little more obviously in the parliamentary style. The U.S. has just had the two political
Interesting.
parties, but like if you ever watch European politics where it's more parliamentary style, it's a collection of self-interest groups. You have the Green Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party. On and on. We're exhausting my knowledge of European parties.
We just saw this let's just say in the UK, what they're doing with Starmer and Sunak, and you've got the Labour, you got Labour, the Tories, and then you got the Reform Party with Farage, and can we put together a coalition? You got all these little parties of all their interest groups. Exactly.
Each one has its own thing it wants to get done, and another group doesn't, and then they form these ad hoc coalitions. I think it's one of the better ways of saying politics makes strange bedfellows. Groups you would never think would work together to do in these circumstances to get their own special interest through. So I think that's a great application of that scripture.
Oh, thanks. I was kind of hoping so. Galatians chapter 5 in verses 19 through 21, we won't read the whole thing. It mentions contentions. It mentions selfish ambitions. In fact, it mentions heresies. And actually, heresies is an interesting word. If you really look at the Greek word, it's used in lots of different ways. It's translated factions. Some translations call it party spirit. And it really is this tendency to ally yourself with one group or another based upon their platform. And why do you ally yourself with them? It's to resist those of another, right? It really is just this kind of maneuvering. And the Apostle Paul condemns that as fleshly thinking, trying to figure out what allies can I make so I can resist this other group and what they're doing. And that is a work of the flesh. It's not the way God's mind strives to think. And yet, if you want to do politics, it's inherent. And you might think, well, I want to vote, I want to participate, but I'll avoid all of that. Well, have fun doing that, because that's not the nature. It's like saying, oh, I'm going to wallow in the mud and not get dirty. No, you will, because that's the way, like Mr. Robinson was just saying, that is the way politics works. And sure enough, I have to say my experience in the church, that when I have seen individuals just it's so tempted to get brought into politics, what do you start to see? This kind of party spirit. They're the them, we're the us, and you start to see that same kind of inherently carnal, divisive thinking.
Your next point here is one I think that's easy to underestimate its significance, but it's also at the same time, I think, one of the greatest lessons we have to learn. And it sounds so basic on its face, but God is quite literally the only person that we could trust. And it doesn't matter how, I've thought before about my wife. Do I trust her? Yeah, literally with my life. Yet at the same time, she's still a human being, and there's only so much she can do.
She only accomplished so much in the world.
But anything, like we can put a lot of faith and trust into a politician we think our values are aligned with, and he'll go, hopefully do the best he can.
He's going to make the difference. Yeah. He's going to do it.
But he's just a man at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that point is rooted in Psalm 146 and verse 3. Do not put your trust in princes, nor in a son of man in whom there is no help. And yet, when it comes to politics, it's inherent. It's interesting how personal it has been for some time. But how many think, oh boy, Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, for that matter, is the only hope for the country right now. Only Mr. Trump can turn things around. Only Mr. Biden is going to preserve democracy against this assault. And it's so personal, when even then it's so manipulative-y. I've made up an adjective there, Mr. Robinson.
I like it. You're working editorial, that's allowed.
Which is sad, because manipulative by itself without the "ly" is actually a word. But it's actually even more dangerous, because you see, especially with kind of a religious tint to it, you see people thinking, well, so-and-so is actually God's man. And I see that more concerning Mr. Trump and such. Well, Mr. Trump is God's man. Well, that doesn't make sense on so many fronts. It just doesn't. Because then let's say, well, was he God's man in the last election? Because he didn't win. I mean, you might say he won but was cheated out of it. Regardless, God did not put Mr. Trump in office the last 4 years. Maybe he wanted a 4-year break. Maybe he plans on putting him in next. I have no idea who he's going to have be elected next. But that said, God, who God's man is? Jesus Christ. That's who God's man is, and I haven't seen him on the ballot recently. Not that I've looked at ballots. The idea that, to start to attach God to one man is virtually like putting your trust in a prince.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular case, it's, again, talk about standards changing. Someone who has a position on abortion, someone who held up with pride in 2015 or 16 a LGBT flag that said LGBTs for Trump and held it up with a smile like, yeah, look at this. God doesn't want us putting our faith into person. And Mr. Robinson has highlighted for me at least one, if you will, Church of God, quote unquote, organization out there that is saying things like, nothing will change in this country until Trump returns. Well, since when have we been called to proclaim the return of Donald Trump as the gospel? That's not, what's going to change in this country is the return of Jesus Christ.
And the one time I shared it with you, I observed the defense of a politician who was lying. Well, I mean, does he lie worse than any other politician? And I thought, whoa, do we want to be in a position where we're having to defend the lying of our candidate we think is better?
Yeah, it's so funny. What God doesn't do about David and his adultery with Bathsheba is say, well, look, compared to most kings, just one, that's not so bad. He doesn't do that. He holds him accountable to that. Man, Mr. Robinson, that is such a great point. We've seen that amongst those not in the living church of God, but outside the living church of God, those who proclaim to stand for Jesus Christ as we would understand him, as a law-abiding, the one who supports God's law, and to get so, if you will, in the tank. What do you say? When they're really in the, can't think of the word, not in the hopper. Is it in the tank?
Completely in the tank for
yeah,
so-and-so?
completely in the tank. Yeah, for a candidate, in this case, Mr. Trump. That they might as well be a part of the Republican Party advertising. It's like, wow, God doesn't make those kind of excuses for people.
Yeah, no, I've seen enough that I would consider it that they're carrying water for a politician.
Absolutely. And let me say, we're not trying to talk about that it's wrong to have the human tendency to personally prefer one over the other. I went on record there, like I did earlier in this podcast. In 2016, I certainly was hoping that Mr. Trump would be elected, not because I thought he was, the magnum opus of what it means to be a really good president, but I was just looking at the issues and hoping, boy, I really hope religious liberties preserved long enough we can keep doing the work and such. And definitely, we're not talking about not having a preference. Please understand that. We're talking about actually being involved, actually trying to spread a political message. We just don't do that.
Yeah, because we do have our own personal opinions, and we do observe what's going on in our country, and we actually care about what's going on in our country. And I like the way you framed it, though, that really that should be ideal, giving us the best conditions to continue doing God's work. As what part of our investment in it.
Well, let me say one thing before I forget, because I from what you're saying, what I just said about having our preferences. What if we were okay with being political? What if God's like, I don't really care. You bet. Want to have some sermons on who's the best candidate, and you get out there and vote. Studies have shown that, and I don't know if the studies were restricted to Americans. I'm not sure. I need to go back and look at the study, but they've shown that political ties and ties rooted in political ideology tend to be stronger even than ties of faith and religion.
Really?
Yeah, so that you're more likely to have a rift among people of a certain faith over politics than you are to have a rift in politics over religion.
I totally believe that, because I've listened to enough podcasts where somebody you might not expect admits that, I actually support Trump in this next election, and they'll talk about it, and then he'll say, I've lost friends and family members over it.
Yeah. And so imagine that. What if God didn't hold the standard he does, where we are not to be political and we are not to get involved, and we are to trust him and allow him what he reserves for himself, which is to set up leaders and appointments. Well, what if we did get involved? Can you imagine how terrible it would be, in the church? Because guess what? People are going to have different political ideas. It's just the way it's going to be, because it wouldn't just be for president. I mean, you've got different candidates, you got different Congress, you've got, this judge of this or sheriff of that. And imagine if we did allow that, we'd be experiencing what a lot of churches in the world are experiencing.
Okay. This might be a neat way to tie this up. You talk about people having different perspectives. Okay.
Yep.
So tomorrow is July 4th. What is July 4th? It's the United States holiday that commemorates our Declaration of Independence from England, and we view it as threw off the tyranny of King George III, and we established
Americans do, right?
Yeah, Americans do, and we established our representative republic and all this kind of things. But that's the point. We have a friend here in Charlotte who's from England, who jokingly always calls it Happy Rebellion Day. Even the United States founding, there was another side to this that felt like a bunch of disloyal colonists
Right.
threw off the reign of the king, and it was a rebellion. And you know what? It was.
It was, just kind of like when Israel split with Rehoboam and such. That doesn't mean God likes rebellion, doesn't mean God likes all those kind of things, but God is working out a plan, and God needed to divide Ephraim and Manasseh, and so he did. We should have that larger perspective. And so, yeah, all of our British friends, we're not really celebrating Rebellion Day in that sense. We're celebrating God's plan being fulfilled day. And
yeah. Well, if I may, as a kid growing up, so at least in Texas, middle school was 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and 6th grade was Texas history.
Oh, yeah.
7th grade was U.S. history, and 8th grade was world history. And it just goes to show you how much your view of the world is shaped by the system you grew up in. And I remember being surprised when there was more than one Revolutionary War in the history of humanity. I thought the Revolutionary War always, was the United States fighting against England. And I tell you, younger listeners, there's been many, many, many revolutions over the last 6,000 years. But then the other thing was, I was stumped as to why we were friends with England now when we fought this war against them. I was like, oh, we were on the same side in World War II. Who would have thought?
Yeah, how weird. I don't understand. I don't understand the world, Mom, Dad.
Exactly.
As we start to wrap up, let's remind everyone we're not trying to be anti the people that are running for anything, whether Mr. Trump, Mr. Biden. In fact, who even knows if either of these candidates will be the candidates? And so what we're trying to say isn't attached to people. We're talking about participating in government in general. And in general, and this would be a longer discussion, maybe it'd be actually fun to do for a separate podcast, but the fact is we can't even give you all the verses that illustrate that God's government just isn't democracy. It's not from the bottom up like this. You can look at all of it. Look at every institution God ever created, whether it's marriage, family, the nation of Israel, both before and after the monarchy. Look at the church. Look at the Father and Son themselves existing in glory and eternity. And there is a structure, and it is top down. It is never rule from the bottom up. There's a reason the Church of God, here and there, kind of informally used to call democracy democracy, because that's the devilish kind of government, is where those at the bottom tell those at the top what needs to be done. So as we wrap up, Mr. Robinson, you can tell me if this verse is too harsh. I will accept your judgment. I could not help but think, when it comes to participating in politics, of Jesus' response when someone said he wanted to follow him, but he first wanted to take care of these worldly affairs. In particular, he wanted to wait for his father to die and to bury him.
Mm-hmm. Which would, I believe, would also imply settling the estate. And
all the different things.
There was like a lot going into that phrase.
In fact, we don't even know that the man was dead. It could have been that he was just older. And Jesus Christ gave what sounds like a harsh response, but there's a very profound spiritual principle there in Matthew 8:22. Christ told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." And I thought, man, that's brutal. But that's the point, is that you will always find reasons not to follow me. You know when the time to follow me is? It is right now.
Yes.
Let the dead take care of their own affairs. Join the living. And it's hard for me to see. I mean, does that sound too harsh, Mr. Robinson, apply to this?
Is it too harsh is one question. Is it right on the point? Right on point. Yes, it is. I love that one. And I really do. And when I was younger, I didn't really understand what that meant. And, but it really simplifies things. Really, when you're called by God, the rest of what's going on in the world should just kind of fall away from us and not be any kind of priority. What we should prioritize is following God. And, it's savage because, with the scripture we read earlier, God's pleading through us for humanity to be reconciled with him. And if you're not reconciled to God, well, your fate is death. And most of humanity is in that status right now, or in that you would classify people around the world as kind of just awaiting death in many ways. And so your focus should not be on dealing with that side of humanity in the world. It should be on doing what God asked us to do. And if we do our job with God pleading through us, they will eventually be reconciled to God. They won't be considered the dead in the same way. I don't know if I'm explaining this very well.
No, actually, you're making me feel a lot better about the verse. Thank you very much.
I think that's a hard one to explain.
It is. It's very difficult, but there's so much richness there if you're willing to dive in and do it. So let's just summarize very briefly. God does not want his people trying to fix the devil's world using the devil's tools. Instead, he wants us living and preaching the truth in such a way that people understand there is a better way than all of this. And my friends, our young friends, that is what you and your family have been called to do. Stay out of the voting booth, stay on the path, and preach the kingdom of God through your example to the world as an ambassador.
Smith and Robinson.